In the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces ground eastward through France and Belgium toward the German frontier, the nature of warfare shifted from the sweeping armored advances of summer to the brutal, incremental combat of fortified positions and prepared defenses. The Wehrmacht, though retreating, had not collapsed. German units established defensive lines along rivers, ridges, and forest edges, turning every village into a strong point and every road junction into a killing ground. 40 miles behind the front lines, German supply routes continued to function with mechanical efficiency. Ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements flowed westward through a network of roads, rail lines, and communication nodes. Artillery batteries positioned in depth provided overlapping fields of fire. The German army, though battered, retained its capacity to mount devastating counterattacks precisely because its logistical infrastructure remained largely intact. At First Army headquarters in Verviers, Belgium, intelligence officers identified a critical vulnerability. Near the town of Monschau, along the German-Belgian border, 3 major supply routes converged at a river crossing. The bridge at Monschau carried Wehrmacht truck convoys throughout the night. 2 miles east, a railway marshalling yard transferred artillery shells and fuel drums. For miles beyond that, a radio relay station coordinated artillery fire for an entire corps sector. The concentration of infrastructure created a target of exceptional value, but also exceptional risk. The mission parameters were defined by 3rd Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. A reinforced rifle company, 168 men, would infiltrate behind German lines, conduct coordinated sabotage operations against the bridge, marshalling yard, and radio station, then withdraw before German reserves could organize a response. The operation would require moving undetected through 12 miles of enemy-held territory, conducting simultaneous attacks at 3 separate objectives, and extracting across hostile terrain while pursued. The plan was designated Operation Iron Spear. It would be carried out by Baker Company, 16th Infantry, reinforced with engineer demolition teams, a forward observer team for artillery support, and a communications section with SCR 300 radios. Command fell to Captain James Collier, a 31-year-old officer from Pennsylvania who had led his company through the bocage fighting in Normandy and the street battles in Aachen. His executive officer, First Lieutenant Robert Henshaw, would command the detachment targeting the marshalling yard. Technical Sergeant Earl Morrison, a combat engineer with 2 years of experience in North Africa and Italy, would lead the demolition teams. The operation would launch on the night of November 12, 1944. The moon phase was optimal, a waning crescent providing enough ambient light for navigation without silhouetting infiltrating troops. Weather forecasts predicted fog and intermittent rain, which would suppress visibility and muffle sound. The soldiers would carry 3 days of rations, minimal ammunition loads to reduce weight and noise, and enough explosives to destroy hardened structures. No one spoke the obvious. If anything went wrong deep in enemy territory, there would be no reinforcement and little chance of rescue. Act 1. Preparation and insertion. The preparation phase consumed 4 days. Intelligence officers briefed Collier on aerial reconnaissance photographs showing German positions, patrol patterns, and sentry locations. The photographs, taken by P-38 Lightning aircraft flying at 20,000 feet, revealed remarkable detail. Individual foxholes, machine gun nests with overlapping fields of fire, barbed wire obstacles, and the shadows cast by concrete bunkers. But photographs could not show what terrain felt like underfoot, how rivers ran in November, or where German patrols actually walked versus where they were theoretically supposed to walk. To address these gaps, a reconnaissance patrol infiltrated German lines 3 nights before the main operation. For scouts from the battalion's intelligence and reconnaissance platoon moved forward after dark, slipping through a gap between German positions at the battalion boundary, a seam in the defenses where coordination between units was weakest. The scouts wore mottled camouflage smocks over their standard wool uniforms, their faces darkened with burnt cork. They carried M1 carbines with sound suppressors, experimental equipment issued to specialized units, along with binoculars, compasses, and sketch pads. The scouts spent 18 hours behind German lines, moving only during darkness and early morning fog. They identified patrol routes, timed sentry changes, located minefields by observing German soldiers walking in precise single file through otherwise open ground, and pinpointed machine gun positions by noting fields of fire cleared through undergrowth. One scout discovered a secondary road not shown on maps, a potential escape route. Another observed that German sentries at the bridge changed shifts at 0200 hours, creating a 10-minute window when positions were undermanned. The information gathered during those 18 hours would prove more valuable than weeks of aerial photography. Baker Company began final preparations on November 11th. Soldiers blackened all reflective equipment with charcoal or mud, buckles, canteen cups, rifle slings, anything that might catch moonlight. They taped down items that rattled, dog tags, ammunition pouches, and trenching tools. Each man carried 4 fragmentation grenades, a first aid pouch with morphine syrettes and sulfa powder, and 120 rounds of ammunition distributed between 8-round M1 Garand clips. Squad automatic riflemen carried Browning automatic rifles with 12 20-round magazines. Machine gun teams brought M1919A 4 air-cooled weapons with 1,200 rounds per gun, accepting the weight penalty for the firepower. The demolition teams carried the mission's true payload. Each engineer hauled 40 pounds of composition C, 2 plastic explosive, blasting caps, time fuses, and safety fuse. The bridge team carried shaped charges designed to cut through steel girders and concrete pylons. The marshalling yard team brought incendiary thermite grenades to destroy fuel dumps. The radio station team packed magnetic limpet mines that would adhere to metal surfaces and detonate with magnetic influence fuses. At 2,100 hours on November 12th, Baker Company moved out. They departed from a forward assembly area in the Hurtgen Forest, a nightmarish landscape of shattered trees and cratered earth where the 1st Infantry Division had been grinding through German defenses for weeks. The forest was a charnel house. Bodies hung in trees. Mines littered every trail, and the smell of death permeated everything. Soldiers moved in single file through lanes cleared by engineers, following white tape that marked safe paths through minefields. The column crossed the line of departure at 2,145 hours, passing through positions held by the 26th Infantry Regiment. Soldiers in forward foxholes watched silently as Baker Company filed past, their expressions conveying equal measures of respect and relief that someone else was heading into the darkness. Beyond the foxholes lay no man's land, a belt of contested ground neither side fully controlled, swept by random artillery fire and prowled by patrols from both armies. For the first 2 hours, the company moved through devastated terrain where fighting had raged days earlier. Shell craters filled with rainwater, barbed wire tangled through undergrowth. Abandoned equipment littered the ground, German helmets, American field jackets, empty ammunition boxes. The soldiers picked their way carefully, testing each step, moving with agonizing slowness. Any sudden noise could trigger German artillery or machine gun fire. At midnight, they reached the infiltration point identified by the reconnaissance patrol, a ravine cutting through German defensive lines. The ravine was steep-sided, choked with brush and treacherous underfoot, but it was not mined, and German positions overlooked it rather than occupying it. The soldiers descended in darkness, gripping roots and branches, sliding down muddy slopes, biting back curses when they stumbled. At the ravine floor, a stream ran fast and cold, swollen by autumn rains. The water reached knee-deep, soaking through boots and trousers. Soldiers waded through as quietly as possible, the sound of rushing water covering the noise of their movement. Emerging from the ravine, the company entered enemy-held territory. They were now 3 miles behind German lines, moving through a landscape that appeared peaceful but was saturated with danger. Every shadow could conceal a sentry. Every sound required interpretation, Was that footsteps or wind in branches? The soldiers moved in tactical column, maintaining 5-meter intervals, weapons at the ready, eyes scanning constantly. Captain Collier navigated by compass and terrain association, using features identified in reconnaissance photographs. A distinctive rock formation, a lightning-struck tree, a barn with half its roof collapsed. At 0215 hours, the company halted abruptly. A German patrol was moving perpendicular to their route. 12 soldiers walking in loose formation, talking quietly in German, their discipline relaxed because they believed themselves safely behind their own lines. Baker Company froze in place, soldiers dropping prone, weapons oriented toward the threat. The German patrol passed within 30 meters, so close that American soldiers could hear individual conversations, the clink of equipment, the crunch of boots on frost-hardened ground. The patrol passed without detecting the Americans. Collier waited 5 full minutes before allowing movement to resume, ensuring the Germans were well clear. The incident reinforced what every soldier already knew. They were deep in hostile territory, surrounded by enemies, and survival depended on remaining undetected. By 0400 hours, the company had covered 8 miles and reached the objective area. They occupied a forested hillside overlooking the convergence of supply routes. Below them, the bridge at Monshaw spanned a river 40 feet wide. Truck convoys crossed at irregular intervals, their headlights dim under blackout restrictions. 2 miles to the east, the marshalling yard was visible as a cluster of lights where German soldiers worked under floodlights, transferring cargo from rail cars to trucks. The radio relay station lay beyond visual range, but had been precisely located by signal intelligence. Collier established a company command post in a cluster of boulders that provided overhead cover and concealment. He deployed security teams to establish a perimeter, positioned the light machine guns to cover likely German approach routes, and sent runners to coordinate with the 3 assault elements. The coordination phase was critical. All 3 attacks needed to occur simultaneously. If one target was struck first, the Germans would alert the others and reinforce defenses. Synchronization depended on precise timekeeping. Each team leader had synchronized his watch against Collier's before departure. The assault was scheduled for 0530 hours, timed to coincide with the darkest period before dawn. That gave the teams 90 minutes to move into final assault positions. They would not get a second chance. Act 2, the assault. The bridge team, led by Technical Sergeant Morrison, consisted of 12 men, 6 riflemen providing security and 6 engineers carrying demolitions. They descended the hillside in darkness, moving from shadow to shadow, using trees and boulders for cover. The final approach required crossing 200 meters of open ground, a killing zone if German sentries detected them. Morrison studied the German positions through binoculars. 2 sentries stood at the western approach to the bridge, stamping their feet against the cold, rifles slung. 2 more occupied a sandbag position at the eastern end. A concrete pillbox overlooked the river from elevated ground, its machine gun embrasure dark but presumably manned. The reconnaissance patrol's intelligence had been accurate. At 0200 hours, the sentries changed shifts, and for approximately 10 minutes, positions were undermanned as relief sentries walked from guard posts to replace those going off duty. At 0155 hours, the relief sentries arrived. Morrison watched as they exchanged brief words with the men they were replacing. The off-duty sentries walking away toward a dugout 200 meters distant. For 7 minutes, the new sentries were settling into position, adjusting their equipment, stamping circulation back into cold feet. They were not yet alert. Morrison signaled his team forward. The riflemen moved first, crawling through frost-stiffened grass, their movements glacially slow. Each man advanced a few meters, then froze, waiting to ensure he had not been detected, then advanced again. It took 20 minutes to cover 200 meters. Behind them, the engineers followed, dragging canvas bags containing explosives. At 0220 hours, the lead rifleman reached a position 30 meters from the western sentries. He signaled back to Morrison. Clear approach, sentries unaware. Morrison brought the demolition team forward while riflemen positioned themselves to engage the German positions if necessary. Each rifleman selected a target, their M1 Garens leveled, safeties off, fingers resting lightly on triggers. The engineers reached the bridge abutments at 0225 hours. Working by touch in near-total darkness, they placed shaped charges against the concrete pylons supporting the bridge's central span. The charges were positioned with geometric precision, calculated to cut through the reinforced concrete and drop the span into the river. Morrison set the time fuses for 0530 hours, giving the team an hour to withdraw. The fuses were chemical devices, glass vials of acid that would slowly eat through copper wire, eventually releasing a striker that would ignite the blasting cap. They were reliable but imprecise, accurate to within 5 minutes. As the engineers worked, one of the shaped charges slipped from its position with a metallic scrape. The sound carried in the pre-dawn stillness. One of the German sentries turned, peering into the darkness, calling out a challenge in German. Morrison froze, his hand on the charge, barely breathing. The sentry stared directly at the bridge abutment, his rifle coming off his shoulder. For 10 seconds, nothing moved. Then another sentry called out, something about hearing rats under the bridge. The first sentry laughed, made a crude joke, and turned away. Morrison completed the placement and activated the fuses. He gave the withdrawal signal, 2 soft clicks with his tongue against his teeth. The team melted back into darkness, retracing their approach route, moving slightly faster now because the operation was committed and speed mattered more than perfect silence. Simultaneously, 2 miles to the east, Lieutenant Henshaw's detachment assaulted the marshalling yard. The objective was more complex than the bridge. 20 rail cars loaded with ammunition and fuel, a wooden warehouse containing supplies, and a locomotive in the process of being coupled to a train. German soldiers worked under floodlights, perhaps 40 men moving cargo, unaware that enemy troops were closing on their position. Henshaw divided his force into 3 elements. One squad would attack the guard positions to suppress resistance. A second squad would assault the locomotive and rail cars, placing thermite grenades on fuel tanks and ammunition crates. The demolition team would destroy the warehouse with plastic explosives. The operation required speed and violence. Once contact was made, surprise would be lost, and German reinforcements would respond within minutes. At 0525 hours, 5 minutes before the synchronized assault time, Henshaw's force moved into final positions. They occupied a tree line 50 meters from the perimeter fence, oriented toward their assigned targets. The soldiers checked weapons one final time, ensuring ammunition magazines were fully seated, grenades were readily accessible, and nothing would malfunction at the critical moment. At 0530 hours precisely, Henshaw fired a green flare from an M8 pyrotechnic pistol, the signal to commence the assault. The response was immediate and devastating. 2 squads opened fire simultaneously with rifles, automatic rifles, and 2 light machine guns. The volume of fire was overwhelming. 70 rounds per second tore through the marshalling yard. German soldiers fell where they stood, cut down before they could react. Others dove for cover behind rail cars and equipment. Floodlights shattered under rifle fire, plunging sections of the yard into darkness. The assault squads rushed forward, vaulting the fence, moving through the chaos with disciplined aggression. Riflemen fired from the shoulder while advancing, the M1 Garand's semi-automatic capability allowing rapid engagement on multiple targets. Bar gunners walked their fire across groups of German soldiers, attempting to organize resistance. Within 90 seconds, organized German resistance had collapsed, but the fighting was far from over. German soldiers in bunkers on the perimeter began returning fire. Machine guns opened up, their tracers lacing through the darkness. Mortar crews, positioned in depth for exactly this kind of emergency, began dropping rounds into the marshalling yard. The first mortar shell landed among the rail cars with a flat crack, spraying shrapnel in all directions. An American soldier fell, clutching his leg, screaming. Another shell exploded near the locomotive, throwing a fireball 30 feet high. The demolition team worked frantically amid the chaos. Engineers placed thermite grenades on fuel drums, incendiary devices that burned at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt through steel. They stuffed blocks of C2 explosive into ammunition crates and set time fuses for 5 minutes, just enough delay to allow withdrawal. One engineer was hit by machine gun fire while placing a charge, the rounds punching through his chest. He collapsed without a sound, dead before he hit the ground. At the warehouse, Technical Sergeant Morrison's 2nd Demolition Team placed 40 pounds of plastic explosive against the building's load-bearing supports. They armed the charges with electrical blasting caps wired to a time-delayed detonator, then sprinted for cover as German machine gun fire chewed through the warehouse walls. Henshaw checked his watch. 0537 hours. 7 minutes into the assault, and German reinforcements would be responding. He fired the withdrawal flare, a red star cluster that burst overhead. The assault squads began pulling back by fire teams, one team providing covering fire while another withdrew, then reversing roles. The wounded were dragged back, soldiers refusing to leave casualties behind even as mortar fire intensified. At 0541 hours, the charges detonated. The warehouse erupted in a massive explosion that sent a pressure wave rolling across the marshalling yard. The building disintegrated, debris raining down across a 100-meter radius. 3 seconds later, the thermite grenades ignited. Fuel drums exploded in sequence, each detonation feeding the next, creating a cascading inferno. Ammunition began cooking off, individual rounds detonating, then entire crates exploding with earth-shaking force. The locomotive's boiler ruptured under the heat, releasing superheated steam in a shrieking blast. The marshalling yard became an inferno. Flames rose 200 feet into the air, visible for miles. The light was so intense that American soldiers withdrawing across open ground cast sharp shadows. German machine gunners, momentarily blinded by the glare, fired wildly, their tracers arcing harmlessly overhead. For miles away, the radio relay station came under attack at the same moment. A reinforced squad of 15 soldiers approached the station from the north, moving through a pine forest that provided concealment almost to the objective. The station consisted of 3 wooden buildings surrounded by a barbed wire fence, with a tall radio mast rising from the central structure. 8 German soldiers manned the position, radio operators and guards. The assault on the radio station was surgical rather than overwhelming. The American squad crept to the fence line undetected, cut through the wire with bolt cutters wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, and infiltrated the compound. 2 soldiers armed with suppressed M1 carbines eliminated the sentries with precise shots to the head and chest, the suppressors reducing muzzle report to a loud cough rather than a gunshot crack. The demolition team entered the main building through a window. Inside, 3 German radio operators sat at equipment consoles, headphones clamped over their ears, focused on their work. They died without understanding what was happening, killed by bursts of automatic fire before they could sound an alarm. The Americans placed magnetic limpet mines on the radio equipment, on the backup generator, and against the base of the radio mast. The charges were set with 5-minute fuses. The squad withdrew as quietly as they had arrived, melting back into the forest. At 0536 hours, the charges detonated in a rippling series of explosions. The radio mast toppled, crashing down across one of the buildings. The transmitters exploded in showers of sparks and burning insulation. The German Corps artillery net went silent. Act 3, the withdrawal. At 0538 hours, the bridge at Monshaw exploded. The shaped charges detonated simultaneously, cutting through concrete and steel with directed explosive force. The bridge's center span sagged, twisted, and collapsed into the river with a thunderous roar. Tons of concrete and steel crashed into the water, sending up a geyser 40 feet high. The German supply route was severed. Captain Collier, observing from the company command post, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. All three objectives had been struck simultaneously. The operation was succeeding, but success depended on what happened next. Extracting 168 men through 12 miles of enemy territory while every German unit in the sector responded. Collier had planned the withdrawal as carefully as the assault. The company would move west-southwest along a route that avoided German strongpoints, using forested terrain for concealment. Prearranged artillery fire would cover their withdrawal. American 105mm howitzers would drop high-explosive shells along likely German approach routes, disrupting pursuit. A secondary objective, a German communications bunker, would be struck by artillery simultaneously with the main attacks, creating the impression of a larger offensive and forcing German commanders to hold reserves in place rather than committing them to pursuit. The company formed into a tactical column and began moving at 0545 hours. They moved fast now, abandoning stealth for speed. Dawn was approaching, which meant German observation posts would soon be able to direct artillery fire accurately. The soldiers jogged when terrain permitted, walked rapidly when it didn't, driven by the knowledge that German infantry would be organizing pursuit operations. Behind them, the marshalling yard burned like a vision of hell. Ammunition continued to detonate in sporadic bursts. The pillar of smoke rose thousands of feet, visible across half the battlefield. German artillery began firing into the area around the marshalling yard, shelling positions where American troops might be, but the company was already a mile away and moving fast. At 0615 hours, full daylight arrived, and with it came German aircraft. A Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter bomber appeared at low altitude, attracted by the smoke from the burning marshalling yard. The pilot spotted the American column moving through partially open ground and dove to attack, his 20mm cannons firing. The soldiers scattered, diving into ditches and behind trees as cannon shells chewed through the forest, splintering branches and throwing up geysers of dirt. 2 men were hit, one killed instantly, the other wounded with shrapnel through his shoulder and side. The company's attached forward observer called for anti-aircraft support. Within minutes, American M45 quad-mount vehicles, half-tracks mounting 4.50 caliber machine guns, moved up to forward positions and engaged the German aircraft. The Quad 50s hammered out 2,400 rounds per minute combined, filling the sky with tracers. The FW-190 broke off, trailing smoke, and disappeared to the east. But the aircraft had revealed the company's position. German artillery began ranging on the area. The first shells fell long, exploding 200 meters ahead of the column. Collier ordered increased speed and a course change to throw off the artillery calculations. The soldiers ran now, no longer conserving energy, driven by the immediate threat of high-explosive shells. The next salvo landed close enough that soldiers felt the concussion, heard the whine of shrapnel cutting through air. At 0645 hours, the company reached a destroyed village, 6 buildings reduced to rubble by earlier fighting. Collier made a tactical decision. They would move through the village despite the risk of ambush because it offered the fastest route. The alternative was detouring through open fields that were certainly under German observation. The soldiers entered the ruins in squad columns, weapons oriented outward, moving from cover to cover. The village was silent except for the creak of damaged structures settling. Then German machine gun fire erupted from a cellar position, a stay-behind team that had allowed the Americans to enter the kill zone before opening fire. The MG-42 machine gun, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, created an impenetrable wall of lead across the street. 3 American soldiers were hit in the first burst, falling in tangled heaps. The rest of the company took cover behind rubble, returning fire. A squad leader threw smoke grenades to obscure the German gunners' vision. Under cover of smoke, a fire team maneuvered to the flank, approaching the cellar position from an angle the machine gun could not cover. They dropped fragmentation grenades through the cellar window. The grenades detonated with muffled cracks, and the machine gun fell silent. But the engagement had cost precious time. German infantry were closing from multiple directions, alerted by the sounds of combat. Collier ordered the company to disengage and continue the withdrawal. They left the village at a run, abandoning stealth entirely, focused solely on reaching American lines before German forces could cut them off. At 0720 hours, they encountered a German blocking force, a reinforced platoon that had moved rapidly to intercept. The Germans occupied positions along a tree line overlooking the American route. They opened fire with rifles, machine guns, and a Panzerschreck anti-tank rocket launcher repurposed for anti-personnel use. The Americans were caught in open ground with minimal cover. Captain Collier made an instant decision. He ordered one platoon to suppress the German position with maximum firepower while the rest of the company maneuvered around the German flank. The suppressing platoon went aground and poured rifle and machine gun fire into the tree line. Not aimed fire, but volume fire intended to keep German heads down. Tracers streamed into the trees, starting small fires in dry underbrush. While the Germans focused on the suppressing element, two platoons moved through a ravine that flanked the German position. They emerged behind the German line and assaulted from the rear. The attack was swift and brutal. Close-range rifle fire, grenades thrown into positions, soldiers firing from the hip while advancing. The German position collapsed within minutes, survivors retreating in disorder. But the company had taken casualties. 8 men were dead, 15 wounded seriously enough to require assistance walking. The wounded were distributed among the squads, soldiers supporting injured comrades, refusing to abandon anyone. Movement slowed significantly. At 0805 hours, American artillery fire began falling along prearranged defensive fire coordinates. The 105mm shells created a curtain of explosions between the company and pursuing German forces, buying critical minutes. The sounds of the bombardment, the freight train whistle of incoming shells, the sharp crack of detonations, were the most beautiful sounds the soldiers had heard all morning. At 0840 hours, Baker Company crossed back through American lines, passing through positions held by the 26th Infantry Regiment. Soldiers in the forward foxholes stood and cheered as the columns stumbled past, exhausted, filthy, bloodied, but intact. Behind them, pillars of smoke still rose from the destroyed objectives. Act 4, Aftermath. Baker Company assembled in a rear area at 1,100 hours for debriefing and medical treatment. Of the 168 men who had departed 12 hours earlier, 14 were dead and 23 wounded. The casualties represented 22% of the force, high but not catastrophic by infantry standards. Every survivor was physically and mentally exhausted, operating on adrenaline and willpower alone. Captain Collier reported to battalion headquarters at 1,300 hours. His after-action report was precise and factual. The bridge at Monshaw was destroyed, the marshalling yard completely burned out, and the radio relay station eliminated. Intelligence officers estimated that German supply operations in the sector would be disrupted for a minimum of 2 weeks, potentially longer. The Corps artillery net had been silenced for 6 hours before backup communications were established. 3 German infantry companies and an artillery battery had been pulled from defensive positions to pursue Baker Company, weakening German lines at a critical point. Aerial reconnaissance photographs, taken at 1,400 hours, confirmed the damage. The bridge was gone, its central span resting in the river. The marshalling yard was a blackened wasteland, twisted railroad tracks, burned-out vehicles, cratered ground. Small fires still burned among the rubble. The radio station was demolished. Its mast collapsed across the compound. But numbers and reconnaissance photographs could not capture what the operation had cost. 14 soldiers had died behind enemy lines. Their bodies recovered during the withdrawal and now wrapped in canvas, awaiting burial. 23 men were wounded, some severely, facing weeks or months of hospitalization. Every survivor carried the psychological weight of the operation. The fear of moving through darkness deep in enemy territory, the violence of close combat, the sight of comrades killed, the exhaustion of running under fire. Technical Sergeant Morrison, the demolition team leader, sat alone after the briefing, smoking a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. He had led men into combat, watched them die, made split-second decisions that determined who lived and who didn't. The bridge was destroyed, mission accomplished, but the engineer who had been shot while placing charges had been 22 years old, from Iowa, and Morrison had known his first name was Daniel, but not his last name. And now Daniel from Iowa was dead, and Morrison would carry that weight forever. Lieutenant Henshaw, who had commanded the marshalling yard assault, wrote letters to the families of the men killed under his command. The letters were formulaic because there was no other way to write them. Your son died bravely in the service of his country. He did not suffer. He will not be forgotten. The letters were simultaneously true and utterly inadequate. How could Henshaw explain what had actually happened? The chaos, the violence, the randomness of who lived and who died. How could he convey that some men died instantly while others screamed for medics? That courage and cowardice coexisted in the same human heart? That war was nothing like the training films and everything like a nightmare you couldn't wake from? But for all the cost, Operation Iron Spear had achieved its objectives. German supply operations in the Monshaw sector were crippled. Artillery support was disrupted. German commanders were forced to divert resources to rear area security rather than reinforcing frontline positions. In the calculus of warfare, where success was measured in territory gained and casualties inflicted, the operation was judged a success. Epilogue: the Soldiers' War. Operation Iron Spear represented a single night's work in a war that lasted years and consumed millions of lives. It was not a decisive battle that changed the course of the war. No historians would write books specifically about the destruction of a bridge and a marshalling yard in Belgium. But it was representative of the kind of operation that determined outcomes. Small unit actions conducted behind enemy lines, executed by exhausted soldiers operating far from support, succeeding through technical competence and sheer determination. The men of Baker Company returned to frontline duties after 3 days of rest. They participated in the fighting during the Battle of the Bulge, where German forces launched a massive counteroffensive in December 1944. They advanced into Germany in the spring of 1945, crossing the Rhine, reducing fortified positions, liberating concentration camps. Some were killed in subsequent operations. Others survived to see VE Day. All were marked by their experiences. Captain Collier received the Distinguished Service Cross for planning and executing Operation Iron Spear. He accepted the medal without ceremony, distributed the credit among his subordinates, and never spoke of the operation in detail. Lieutenant Henshaw was promoted to captain and given command of his own company. Technical Sergeant Morrison continued leading demolition teams until he was wounded by artillery fire during the Rhine crossing. He survived, but lost his left hand and was evacuated to the United States. The bridge at Monshaw was never rebuilt during the war. German engineers constructed a temporary crossing 2 miles south, but the delay and rerouting disrupted supply schedules for weeks. The marshalling yard was abandoned as too damaged to repair. The radio relay station was replaced, but the new location was less optimal, resulting in degraded communications coverage for German artillery units. In a larger narrative of World War II, Operation Iron Spear occupied no significant place. But for the 168 men who infiltrated behind German lines on the night of November 12, 1944, it was the defining experience of their war. They had moved through darkness into enemy territory, conducted coordinated attacks against defended positions, and withdrawn under fire. 14 of their comrades had died. They themselves had survived through a combination of training, discipline, luck, and the incomprehensible randomness that determined who lived and who died in combat. The operation illustrated fundamental truths about infantry warfare in World War II. Success depended on detailed planning, accurate intelligence, technical competence with weapons and demolitions, small unit leadership, and the physical and mental endurance of individual soldiers. But even perfect planning could not eliminate chaos, confusion, or the terror of combat. Even the best intelligence missed details that became life-or-death factors. Even elite soldiers made mistakes, felt fear, broke under pressure. Warfare was not clean or heroic. It was mud and blood and exhaustion and fear and the smell of burning and the sounds of wounded men screaming and the weight of carrying a dead friend's body through darkness. The soldiers who survived carried those experiences for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of the war frequently, processing trauma through repetition. Others never mentioned it, locking memories away in places they refused to visit. Some are proud of their service, rightfully so. Others felt only relief that they had survived and guilt that others had not. There was no single narrative, no unified interpretation. Each soldier's war was unique, shaped by individual experiences and perceptions. But they all shared one truth. They had done what was asked of them. They had infiltrated behind enemy lines, conducted their missions, and returned. They had demonstrated the capacity of human beings to function under conditions of extreme stress, to organize violence effectively, to risk death for abstract concepts like duty and country. They had proven that ordinary men from ordinary towns could perform extraordinary actions when circumstances demanded. Operation Iron Spear was their story, one small chapter in the vast, terrible narrative of World War II. It was a story of technical competence and tactical success, but also of human cost and individual sacrifice. It was a story that deserved to be remembered, not for glory or heroism, but for what it revealed about the nature of war and the soldiers who fought it.